In the previous chapter, we saw the underdog Joseph finally set free from his wrongful imprisonment, and not only restored to society, but in fact elevated to a status that he would not have otherwise found himself in had he not gone through such tremendous hardship. Indeed, Joseph was now essentially the second in command in the hierarchy of the Egyptian kingdom, but considering the actual Pharaoh seemed more content to let Joseph take the wheel, that Joseph was the real leader here in these times. After all, Joseph was seen to not only predict the terrible famine that would seemingly affect all the world, but he was also seen to successfully navigate it, ensuring that enough food was stored for this catastrophe during Egypt's years of abundance. Many will agree that Joseph's newfound position of power and privilege was certainly something he deserved. After all, this was a man who experienced many hardships that came about as a result of other people's transgressions. Remember, Joseph's brothers had been so jealous of him that they beat him and threw him down a well, before selling him off into slavery. Later, Joseph, who found himself in the service of the Pharaoh's guard, Potiphar, would resist the affections of his scandalous wife, leading her to not only become scorned, but also to lie about Joseph making advances on her. Naturally, this landed Joseph in prison, for a crime he didn't even commit. But at this part of the story, Joseph was a free man, and once more found himself in a position, courtesy of the Pharaoh, that few ex-prisoners would ever find themselves in. A position of power. Genesis 42 takes a step away from Joseph, and we return to one of the more complicated characters of Genesis, Joseph's father, Jacob. The Bible tells us that the famine Joseph interpreted from Pharaoh's dreams did not just affect Egypt, but that it affected the whole world. Here, even Jacob and his people, who lived in the land of Canaan, were starting to feel the effects of the famine. But Jacob learns that there was grain in Egypt because some super wise and forward-thinking individual decided to store tons of the stuff. Of course, Jacob doesn't realize that the grain in Egypt had been gathered by his favorite son. Remember, Joseph's brothers lied to Jacob, telling him that he'd been torn to pieces by wild animals. Here, Jacob tells his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Some may pick up on Jacob's frustrations here, as he seems to chastise his sons' inactivity, asking them why they just keep looking at each other, instead of getting up to do something about it. Remember, in his youth, Jacob wasn't the type of man to just sit on his hands, even if this is what God had wanted him to do. In his youth, Jacob would have probably been out in Egypt swindling people for grain, or using his wiles and tactics to scheme and obtain the advantage. At the very least, Jacob would have been actively trying to find a solution and wouldn't have just left it to God. This was a man who even tried wrestling an angel, or God at one point after all. So I'd say his irritation at his son's idleness is pretty valid. Another interpretation here is that the reason why the brothers are looking at each other isn't born from their lack of enthusiasm, but more so stems from their guilt. They are looking at each other because they are each sharing in the guilt of having sold Joseph into Egyptian slavery. The mere mention of Egypt might have triggered some feeling of compunction or sadness, and this might be a little snippet into understanding that though the brothers had done something wicked, they were regretful and it did haunt them. With this idea, when Jacob asks them why they are looking at each other, he isn't irritated, but more so curious, as he suspects there is something there that they are not telling him. The Bible continues, "So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were amongst those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also." It's interesting to note here that Jacob does not send Benjamin. Benjamin was the other son of Jacob's favourite wife Rachel, the one he really loved and the one he had chosen, before he'd been coerced by Laban into marrying her sister Leah too. Now, considering Jacob had lost Joseph some 20 years prior to the famine, he was now extra protective of Benjamin, the last remaining son and image of the woman he truly loved. Some might say that Jacob might have even suspected that there was foul play at hand when it came to Joseph, and that his brothers, the sons of Leah, might have had something to do with it. With this in mind, it makes sense why Jacob decided not to send Benjamin with them, because in some capacity, he probably didn't trust them. Now when Joseph's brothers arrive, they immediately bow down to him, with their faces to the ground. But they recognize him only as the governor of the land, not the boy they had beaten up and sold into slavery. Joseph, on the other hand, recognizes them immediately, but instead of revealing his true identity to his brothers, he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked, and his brothers replied, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." We know that Joseph would have used an interpreter in order to authenticate the ruse. The brothers would have been surprised to find an Egyptian lord who could also speak Hebrew, so Joseph pretended he couldn't understand them, thus necessitating the need for a translator. What's more, we also see that Genesis tells us that Joseph spoke harshly to his brothers. He was not welcoming, and perhaps allowed himself to actualize some of the anger he had harbored towards his brothers for what they had done to him. True, the turn of events had caused Joseph to rise up and become the great man he ended up becoming, but that journey was full of pain and hardship, all of it traceable back to that one moment back in Canaan, where he was thrown down the well. It's also likely that Joseph felt bitter towards his brothers because they had robbed him of time with his father Jacob, who, we know, had a closer relationship than any of the other siblings. Joseph is humanized in his anger, and we see him act in accordance to how any one of us might react to seeing people who have wronged us. Realistically, if Joseph wanted his brothers to suffer, he could have very easily used his authority to have them beaten and thrown in jail. But instead, Joseph demonstrates control here, and though he is harsh with his words, he is not so harsh with his actions. The Bible then tells us, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Readers might remember that in chapter 37, when Joseph was 17, he did have a dream about his brothers which he told them. Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." We can certainly see the parallel between Joseph's dreams and the actual reality that was happening around him. As his brother's sheaves bowed down to Jacob's, so too did they bow down to him now in Egypt. Of course, at that time, when they'd first heard Joseph recount the dream, the brothers probably thought Joseph was mugging them off, as they proceeded to challenge him, asking him mockingly if he intended to rule them. Naturally, they would not have picked up on the symbolism here, and probably didn't even remember the dream Joseph had told them in the first place. It isn't clear why Joseph decides to label his brothers here as spies, though it's possible that Joseph knew this accusation would have been taken so seriously that it would have been in his brother's best interests to A, take him seriously, and B, do whatever he told them to do. There is one idea by some scholars that Joseph hadn't meant to be harsh with his brothers at all, and that if he had it his way, he'd have welcomed his brothers and given them all the grain that they wanted, but that God reminded Joseph of his dream and then incited or guided Joseph to maneuver his brothers in exactly the way God wanted. The brothers do attempt to defend themselves here, saying, "We are your servants, 12 brothers, the son of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." It's interesting here that the brothers state that one is no more in reference to Joseph. Could it be the case that the brothers, knowing of how terrible the conditions could be for a slave, just assumed Joseph had died? Or is it conceivable that after having spun the lie about Joseph being dead to their father for so long, that they themselves came to actually believe it too? In any case, you can only imagine Joseph's reaction to hearing that his brothers had lied to his face about his very own fate. Joseph continued, "It is just as I told you. You are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place until your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to go get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." Now, this was not some idle threat, no. Joseph did throw his brothers into prison for 3 whole days, a mere moment when compared to how long Joseph himself had spent in prison. On the 3rd day, he came to them and said, "Do this and you live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and that you may not die." We see here that Joseph may have gotten carried away by throwing his brothers in jail. Sure, I think we can all agree that his brothers deserved it, and that throwing them in jail for 3 days was probably a lighter punishment than what they were owed. But believers will argue that this punishment was not Joseph's to deliver, it was God's. Once more, Joseph is humanized here as he demonstrates an emotional reaction. He is angry with his brothers for what they have done to him. He is upset that they continue to lie to his face, and for that, he gave them a little taste of the life that he had been forced to live because of their jealousy. However, as he specifies, "Do this and you live, for I fear God," it shows us that Joseph knew he could not exact punishment upon his brothers, because this is not what his God wanted. Furthermore, believers might argue that even though Joseph was the victim of his brother's vindictiveness, it was still not his choice to decide his brother's fate. Therefore, he comes to concede that he must allow his God's plan to come into fruition, even if that means setting his brothers free. His demands are clear, however. Joseph wanted his brothers to verify their story by presenting him with Benjamin, the youngest brother. He wanted his brothers to prove that they weren't spies and were in fact who they said they were. Even though they'd already lied to his face once, Joseph was still willing to let his brothers try again, and so granted their freedom. Well, almost. He does keep hold of one of them as collateral, which in fairness to Joseph is a pretty smart move. His brothers couldn't have been trusted, and while some might argue that being imprisoned had humbled them and made them see that this Egyptian lord meant business, it's also equally likely that once they were far enough back to Canaan, they would not have held true to their word and kept the grain they had been given. Some might say that Joseph also knew that his father Jacob was probably starving, so he wanted to make sure that at least he was fed. The only way to do this, of course, was to set his brothers free, so that they may carry the desired supplies back to Canaan. In another sense, Joseph shows mercy here. If he really wanted to, he could have sent the guards back with the brothers and had them personally deliver the grain to Jacob and verify their story that way. Instead, he shows kindness and grants his brothers the opportunity to do the right thing. The Bible tells us that they did exactly what Joseph told them to do, but it's probable that they were reluctant, not because they didn't want to, but because they knew how much their father cherished Benjamin. Jacob would never have allowed Benjamin to leave with the rest of them on a journey back to Egypt, so in some way, the brothers may have felt like their hands were tied either way. With this conundrum, they say to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." This is pretty much an open confession from the brothers, who began to converse with each other as to why they are the ones now suffering. They seem to agree that it is basically karma, that after they'd beaten and sold Joseph off, they were now getting their own just desserts. It's interesting that they were all so quick to think of Joseph, when considering why they are the ones now on the back foot. It suggests that this was something they thought of often, that perhaps whenever something bad did happen in their lives, they reconciled the possibility that it was because they had done something terrible. As mentioned earlier, it's no stretch to say that the transgressions committed against Joseph that day at the well probably haunted the brothers for the rest of their lives. Reuben, one of the brothers who had actually tried to rescue Joseph from his fate, then speaks up, saying to his brothers, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must account for his blood." Reuben further voices his disapproval of what his brothers had done, and it's likely that this was something he admonished them for constantly over the years. However, despite Reuben's good intentions, Reuben is not exempt from the guilt. Remember, he never told his father Jacob the truth of what had happened, and in this, he is complicit with his brother's terrible deed. During the conversation, the brothers did not realize that Joseph could understand them, seeing as he was using an interpreter. The Bible tells us that after hearing this conversation, Joseph turned away from his brothers and began to cry. When he recomposed himself, he decided to take Simeon as collateral and bound him before their eyes. Here we see Joseph so overcome with emotion at the sight of his brother's guilt that he almost gives the game away and breaks down. He even has to leave the room so as to recollect himself. It's possible that Joseph may have wanted to forgive them right there and then, but he also knew that his brothers needed to earn his trust back, and whilst their remorse was a welcome sight, it would not be enough. Therefore, we see him bind Simeon in front of his brothers, almost like a dramatic gesture to show his brothers once more that he is not a man to be taken lightly. It's also interesting that Joseph opts to take Simeon as collateral, considering it was probably Judah who was more of the instigator in the first place. After this, Joseph gave orders for his brothers' bags to be filled with grain. Unbeknownst to his brothers, Joseph also ordered for the silver they had brought with them for payment to be placed back into their bags too, as well as provisions for their journey. After this was done, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. Now, at some point on their journey back home to Canaan, the brothers stopped for the night and opened their sacks to feed their donkeys. There they found the silver. The Bible tells us, "Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, 'What is this that God has done to us?'" As we can see, the brothers are pretty shocked to find the silver, considering that they had used this to pay for the grain in the first place. However, their response is pretty indicative of men who were, at least in this scenario, righteous and good. They don't start considering how they'd scored a bargain or debating how to spend the silver, but rather feel genuine despair at this revelation. If anything, they are afraid, not just for themselves, but for their brother Simeon, who in their minds could have been killed as soon as the Egyptian lord learned he had been swindled. Furthermore, they were already suspected as being spies. Now it would seem they were thieves too. "What is this that God has done to us?" they exclaim, showing us that these were not men who found joy in this free money. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's as if the money pained them. When they arrive home in the land of Canaan, they told their father Jacob what had happened to them. Funnily enough, as they start emptying their sacks, they find other pouches of silver, one for each of the brothers. When they and Jacob see this money, they are described in the Bible as being frightened. Frightened of retaliation from the Egyptians, frightened for Simeon's life, and probably frightened of being considered a thief under the eyes of their God. After having told their father that they needed to take Benjamin to Egypt in order to free Simeon, Jacob chastises his sons and in fact reveals to them that he knows a lot more about what happened with Joseph's disappearance than they realized. He states, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." In some translations, Jacob admonishes his sons for having bereaved him. In this, readers might get the idea that Jacob, deep down, always knew the truth about Joseph, and that whilst he couldn't prove his brothers had done something to him, he always had a sneaky suspicion. Whether instinctively or through his God, Jacob knew that Joseph had been the victim of foul play, and that his brothers were responsible. "Everything is against me," Jacob declares, revealing his state of mind. Having already lost his favourite son Joseph, he was now being asked to lose his favourite son Benjamin. Jacob is undoubtedly depressed at this point. There is no silver lining, no positive outlook, and probably, once again, as is habit with Jacob, probably no God watching over him. Instead of trusting in his God as he had done before, Jacob is blinded by his current situation and cannot help but feel overwhelming devastation. After this, Reuben said to his father, "You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring Benjamin back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." These are pretty strong words from Reuben, arguably one of the more sensible and good-hearted brothers, considering he did try and tell the others to leave Joseph alone. Of course, Jacob probably wouldn't have seen it this way, considering if we harken back to Genesis 35, Reuben had slept with his concubine Bilhah and gotten her pregnant with his sons Dan and Naphtali. So with Reuben's promise to let Jacob kill his sons, it probably didn't come across as reassuring as Reuben intended it to be. In fact, Jacob probably wouldn't have minded killing Reuben's sons anyway, considering they would no doubt be a constant reminder of his own son's betrayal. In any case, Jacob is adamant, stating, "My son Benjamin will not go down to Egypt with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow." From this, we can confirm that Jacob probably wasn't that big of a fan of Simeon, or at least wasn't going to risk Benjamin's life in order to free him from imprisonment. Additionally, we can see he didn't much care about Reuben's gesture to let him kill his own sons if he failed. To be honest, it's likely the case that Jacob didn't believe Reuben would live up to his promise, and considering how his sons had behaved thus far, readers would agree that Jacob had the right of it. Readers might continue to notice the favoritism shown by Jacob towards the sons of Rachel, for he also speaks as if he only has the one son. "My son will not go down to Egypt," he states, continuing to alienate the sons of Leah as well as to remind them that in some sense he didn't see them in the same light. It becomes clear from the end of Jacob's outburst that he is not the same Jacob of Genesis 33, the one who had reunited with his brother Esau and set up an altar to God at Paddan Aram. Some readers may have seen this altar as a testament to Jacob's final acceptance of God, and that after all his years of trying to outthink God, or even at one point physically wrestle against him, that Jacob was finally at peace, both emotionally and spiritually. Here in Genesis 42, we see a very different Jacob, however, arguably the antithesis of everything he had been all those years ago. He was depressed, he was outraged, he was old and tired, and perhaps through these dreadful combinations, he had turned away from God once more. Perhaps the catalyst was losing Joseph in the first place, and that after this, he could not bring himself to trust in God ever again, for the pain of this loss was simply unbearable. This all culminates into what Jacob becomes here, fiercely protective of Benjamin, harsh and brooding, and undeniably unhappy. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.